How's that? That look all right?
Looks good to me. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks to all of you who are in attendance wherever you are. I want to start before I get into my formal presentation. I just have a personal note that I want to make. I first got interested in 19th century baseball about 12 years ago. And I've learned about it in the traditional ways that historians, amateur and professional, learn from the original source material, newspapers, and things like that. But I've also learned a lot about 19th century baseball from watching it be recreated today in what is known as vintage baseball. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit during my talk. Vintage baseball in New Jersey got started about 20 years ago when a man by the name of Paul Solomoni founded the Elizabeth Resolutes vintage baseball team, which also made him the founder of vintage baseball in New Jersey. Last week, I think all of us in the, I know all of us in the vintage baseball world were surprised and shocked to learn of Paul's passing from cancer. I had been in touch with him, but had no idea that he was so ill. And I want to mention that because what he did really added to everybody's knowledge of 19th century baseball. It's one way of learning, and I just want to take note of that tonight. The title of my talk tonight is A Cradle of the National Pastime, New Jersey Baseball, 1855 to 1880. I think there are two important words in that title. The first important word is the word cradle. And I hasten to say that a cradle is very different from a birthplace. A cradle is a framework or a structure that helps somebody or something move from infancy into a more mature state. And I'm going to argue that New Jersey played just that kind of role in the early days of organized baseball. The second important word is the word because what I am definitely not suggesting that New Jersey was the only cradle that baseball had. Babies can have multiple cradles, and I think the same thing was true of organized baseball. New Jersey was one of a number, and certainly not the least. The period I'm going to cover tonight begins in 1855 because that's the year the first New Jersey baseball teams took the field. I need to go back a little bit earlier, though, in order to give you some context and background. If the first New Jersey teams took the field in 1855, that means that baseball was still a relatively young sport, less than 20 years old. Because as we all know, this man, Abner Doubleday, invented baseball in the summer of 1839 in Cooperstown, New York. We all know that, right? Now, well, we know that there is no evidence that Abner Doubleday invented baseball. In fact, there is no evidence that Abner Doubleday ever played baseball. There's no evidence he ever went to a baseball game. We do know, in fact, that games called baseball were played in this country well back into the 18th century. This slide is an illustration of just one such case. This is a picture of the earliest identified baseball player, a man by the name of John Ray Smith, who, while a student at the College of New Jersey, today's Princeton University, in 1786, wrote in his journal that he had this day played a game, he had played baseball, B-A-S-T-E-B-A-L-L, 2 words. A year later, the faculty at Princeton prohibited the playing of baseball. And nobody bothers to prohibit something people aren't already doing. So clearly baseball was being played well back into the 18th century. We know next to nothing about those games other than the fact that they were played. We know a lot more about what I'll call organized baseball. Organized baseball gets its start in New York City in the 1830s and the 1840s. For that reason, historians today call it the New York game. And at the core of the early days of organized baseball was an institution called the Baseball Club, very much like today's modern not-for-profit corporation. The first baseball clubs were formed in New York City, also in the 1830s and 1840s. The most famous of those clubs is this group, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club of New York City, formed in September of 1845. Now, like Abner Doubleday, The Knickerbockers get a lot of credit in baseball history for things that they did not do. They were not the first baseball club. They did not invent baseball, and they most definitely did not play in the first baseball game. But unlike Abner Doubleday, the Knickerbockers are justly famous because the game that they played, the game that they popularized, and above all, the game that they formalized in writing is the direct ancestor of today's game. We can take the game that was played a few weeks ago, the World Series between the Rays and the Dodgers, and we can trace it all the way back to the game that the Knickerbockers played in the 1840s. Now, some of you have doubtless heard that on June 19th, 1846, the Knickerbockers at Elysian Fields in Hoboken played the first baseball game, a game against the New York club, a game that they lost by the score of 23-1. There was with no doubt, this was not the first baseball game. It is well documented that their opponents, the New York club, played 3 baseball games in October of 1845, a good 8 months before this game. What's interesting, however, about this game is that after this game, it will be almost 5 years before the Knickerbockers play another match game, that is a game against another team. Why so long? Well, they lost the first game by a score of 23-1. Maybe they were bad losers. But the real reason is that the Knickerbockers, like all of these early baseball clubs, were primarily social clubs who played baseball for exercise. They put the emphasis upon what they called practice, but what we would call inter-squad games, where they get together to play maybe 2 days a week, and they choose up sides, play a game. The next time they get together, they choose up possibly very different sides. So there's no consistency, no special meaning to any particular game. This begins to change for the Knickerbockers on June 3rd, 1851, when they play a match game against the Gotham Club of New York, a new incarnation of the New York club. And they win this game. And less than 2 weeks later, they win the rematch. So competitive baseball is here to stay and obviously continues right to the present time. From 1851 to 1854, there are basically 3 baseball clubs playing competitively. All New York clubs, the Knickerbockers, the Gotham Club, and the Eagle Club of New York. And they play a number of their games here at Elysian Fields in Hoboken. They don't play very many games a year, but they play some of them here. And this is actually a drawing from an 1857 match between the Gotham Club and the Eagle Club. But I wanted to give you a sense of what Elysian Fields might have looked like in those days. If you can see behind the trees in the outfield, you can get a glimpse of the Hudson River, in fact, with a sailboat on the river. Beginning in 1855, organized baseball goes through a rapid growth spurt for reasons that we don't totally understand, a growth spurt that will continue through the Civil War. Nowhere is that growth more rapid and more extensive than it is in New Jersey, moving rapidly through the center of the state as far south as Trenton. In 1855, organized baseball is played in only 3 places. It's played in New York City, it's played in Brooklyn, which was then a separate city, and it is played in New Jersey. New Jersey in 1855 had 14 baseball clubs, more than New York City and Brooklyn combined. By 1860, New Jersey has 177 baseball clubs playing in 21 different municipalities. Again, more than any other place in the Union other than New York State. Newark alone in 1860 has 52 baseball clubs, as many as Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore combined. Why did this happen? Well, early in the period, the limited ways that you can learn about baseball. There's obviously no internet, no radio or television coverage, and newspaper coverage in the mid 1850s is fairly limited. So really the only ways that you can learn about baseball are through direct personal contact. You play the game yourself, you watch it being played, or you talk to somebody who has either played or watched baseball. The chances of that happening are greatly increased if there is population density and a relatively mobile society. Northern New Jersey in 1855 meets both of those conditions. Newark is the country's 11th largest city, and there are other large population areas in the northern part of the state. Northern New Jersey also has a relatively sophisticated railroad system with its hub at Newark. That's important to the point that almost without exception, the only communities in New Jersey that have baseball clubs before the Civil War also have a direct railroad connection to Newark. So for example, Somerville, which was relatively rural in 1860, has a direct railroad connection to Newark and has its own baseball club. Whereas Paterson, which is the state's third largest city, does not have a direct railroad connection to Newark and does not have a lot of baseball activity until 1860, and not a lot that year alone. Further evidence of this is what happens or what doesn't happen in the southern part of the state. South of Trenton, there is very little, there's no baseball activity, organized baseball activity before the Civil War. The southern part of the state is very sparsely populated. It has very little of a railroad network. And the earliest baseball club, identified baseball club playing the New York game doesn't get started until the fall of 1863 in Bridgeton, New Jersey and Cumberland County. So this is a pretty clear case, I think, that New Jersey plays a cradle-like role in early baseball. If that's true, we would expect to find some baseball firsts taking place during this period. I've learned, however, the hard way, that it's sometimes risky to talk about a baseball first, because just when you think you've discovered something that's a first, somebody discovers something earlier. So instead, I'm going to talk about earliest knowns. What may be the earliest known instance of women playing baseball in the United States took place near Perth Amboy in 1859. The earliest known interscholastic game, not intercollegiate game, but game between two schools, took place in Bloomfield, New Jersey in 1858. And this, I think, is the most interesting of all. This is a newspaper article that I stumbled upon in the Newark Daily Mercury one day at the end of a long day of deciphering microfilm. It's a very brief account of a game between two clubs in Newark. The key word here is the word in parentheses, the insensitive 19th century adjective colored, where today we would say African American or Black. This is the earliest known instance of African Americans organizing to play baseball, not just in Newark, not just in New Jersey, but throughout the United States. Before I found this article, it was believed that the earliest instance was in 1859, some 4 years later. This is no small accomplishment on the part of what was a very small Black community in Newark in 1855. In 1855, Newark had a white male population of over 22,000. They founded 4 baseball clubs. Newark that same year had a male Black population of less than 600. They formed 1 and possibly 2 baseball clubs. We don't know where the Union Club was from, but you'll note about the St. John's Club that it says that its ground or field was at the foot of Chestnut Street. That's an early Newark baseball field. So the St. John's Club was clearly a Newark baseball club. Very impressive accomplishment, very impressive that Newark's Black community got onto the field the same time as their white counterparts. What was it like to be a member of one of these antebellum baseball clubs? Well, fortunately, we can get some sense of that because the bylaws, constitution, and most importantly, the minute book of one such club survive. This is a picture of some pages from the minute book of the Hamilton Baseball Club of Jersey City, founded in late 1857. All these documents are in the Baseball Hall of Fame Library in Cooperstown, and they open for us a window on what it was like to be a member of one of these early New Jersey clubs. According to the bylaws of the Hamilton Club, membership was restricted to 40. Members had to be a member, you had to be nominated by another member of the club. So if you were nominated, your nomination would be referred to a committee on inquiry to evaluate your suitability. However, suitability in this context has nothing to do with your ability to hit, run, or throw. It has everything to do with your social acceptability. These are still primarily social clubs. If the committee on inquiry thinks well of your nomination, they would bring it to the next membership meeting for a vote. Voting was done anonymously. White balls for yes, black balls for no. Anybody who received more than 3 negative votes was disqualified. In 1859, 4 young men are brought forward for a possible election to the club. 2 are voted in unanimously. 1 gets 1 negative vote, so he gets in. But an unfortunate young man by the name of Freeman A. Smith received 6 negative votes and is turned down for membership. He was the son of a prominent Jersey City businessman, a college graduate, which was very unusual in those days, went on to be a prominent Jersey City businessman in his own right. And according to his obituary, he was a well-known clubman, both in Jersey City and in New York. But somehow he managed to offend this not particularly distinguished group of young men. If, however, unlike the unfortunate Mr. Smith, you were accepted for membership, you would then be expected to meet all the requirements of members. You had to start by paying your initiation fee of $2 and then your annual dues of $3. You had to go to practice, you had to go to meetings, you had to go to practice, and above all, you had to take your turn umpiring some of the practice games. If you were interested in playing in match games, that is, games against other teams, you could ask to be considered to be chosen for what was known as the first 9. If you weren't good enough to be on the first 9, you could still conceivably play on the second 9. And clubs would have second 9s that played games against the second 9s of other teams. If you still aren't good enough to be a member of the second 9, you had one last chance. You could take part in what was known as a muffin game. What are muffin games? Well, muffin games are games between 2 teams made up of players who are either less experienced or less skilled, so that if the ball is hit or thrown to them, they are likely to miss or muff it. And that's where the term muffin comes from. There are 2 things that are particularly interesting about the Hamilton Club's bylaws and constitution. The first is that while this was a social club for aspiring young gentlemen, like the case with all of these clubs, they didn't always behave that way. This is true of the Hamilton Club as well as for the Knickerbocker Club. They didn't always behave well, and so the clubs had a series of fines for various forms of misbehavior. In the case of the Hamilton Club, they had fines ranging from 10 cents to 25 cents for offenses like profanity, arguing with the umpire, and my favorite, a 25-cent fine for anticipating the umpire's call before he makes it. Had I been around then, I would have incurred a 25-cent fine more than once. The other thing that's very interesting about the club's bylaws and constitution is that they go into great detail as to how practice is organized, but they make no mention whatsoever of how match games are organized. How do you schedule a game with another team? And that's just another reflection of how the Hamilton Club, like most of these antebellum clubs, were primarily social clubs. That, however, is about to change in New Jersey. In February of 1860, a new club is formed in Newark, the Eureka Baseball Club. This picture was taken about 1865, 1866, when the Eureka were in their prime. It is one of the oldest surviving pictures of a New Jersey baseball club. It's in the collections of the New Jersey Historical Society. When it comes to social credentials, the Eureka take a backseat to nobody. Edward Pennington, who was their founding president, was not only a descendant of one of Newark's founding families, he was the son of one New Jersey governor and the grandson of another. But the Eureka have not come together for social purposes. They have come together to compete, and not just in New Jersey, but at the highest levels. And as we shall see, they will compete for the informal championship of the United States. The Eureka played their first match game in June of 1860 against our friends from the Hamilton Club. They lose to the Hamilton Club, who were no great shakes on the playing field. That was their first game, probably having a little trouble getting organized. But they quickly get their act together and finish their first season with an above 500 record. And I'm sure they were looking forward to the upcoming 1861 season with a great deal of anticipation. Before, however, I talk about baseball in 1861, I'd like to talk a little bit about baseball the way it was played in the 1860s. How does that game compare with today's game? As I've already mentioned, there are a number of ways you can learn about 19th century baseball. You can attend a lecture like this, you can read books about it, and you can also watch 19th century baseball being played today. Vintage baseball is what it's called. And I'm fortunate enough to be the scorekeeper for one of those teams, the Flemington Neshannock Vintage Baseball Club. This is a picture of us, a Civil War tintype photo taken at Gettysburg a number of years ago after a tournament. Let me tell you that kneeling on rock hard ground in 100-degree heat in the long pose required for those tintypes was not a particularly pleasant experience. As you might expect, our entire schedule for 2020 was wiped out by the pandemic. But we're already working on our schedule for 2021, which will be on our website sometime in January. The website is neshannock.org. And you can see where we'll be playing in 2021. We play almost every weekend, April through September, up and down the East Coast. And I would urge you, if we're playing in your area, to come and see a game, even if you only see a few innings. I think you would learn a lot about 19th century baseball, and I think you would enjoy it. If you go to a vintage baseball game, what would you see that you recognize and what wouldn't you recognize? Well, first of all, three things that you would recognize. There will be 9 players on a team, pretty much playing the same positions they play today. The game will last 9 innings, and it will be won by the team that scores the most runs. But those last 2 things have only recently become formalized. The Knickerbockers played a game that was won by the first team to score 21 runs. Games were high scoring in those days, but it wasn't always that easy to reach 21. And one of the debates of the late 1850s is 7 innings versus 9 innings. So if you enjoy the 3.5-hour marathons that are the norm of baseball today, you know who you can thank for it. So those are some things that you would recognize. What wouldn't you recognize? Well, as I said, there would be 9 players on the field playing pretty much the same positions as they play today. However, the pitcher will not be standing 60 feet 6 inches away, throwing the ball overhand from an elevated pitcher's mound. The pitcher will be standing about a little over 40 feet away, and he'll be throwing the ball underhanded from a flat surface. Now, this is where we have the disadvantage of not being in person. The pitcher will be throwing a baseball that looks like this. This is a replica of an 1864 baseball, and I would normally be able to pass it around. I'm holding it next to a modern ball, and you may be able to see that the 1864 ball is a little bigger and a little softer. It is by no means soft, but it's a little softer than a modern ball. Now, the pitcher will be throwing that ball underhanded towards home plate, where a man will be standing holding bats like those that you see in the team picture of the Neshannock. The man holding the bat is, as a rule, known not as the batter, but as the striker. He is not standing in the batter's box. Rather, he is standing over a line, which is known as the striker's line. And you will never at a vintage game hear the umpire say, batter up. Rather, he will say, striker to the line, please. The striker obviously is going to try to hit the ball into the field, where the fielders are going to try to field it with a 19th century baseball glove, which looks something like this. It's called a hand. There are no gloves in 19th century baseball, especially in this period. The only equipment are bats, balls, and bases. Some gloves come in after the 1870s, but at this period, no gloves are being used. That's a major difference. Another major difference is that all batted balls, fair or foul, caught on a bounce are an out. Trust me, that makes for a major difference. For example, as a rule, outfielders play very deep, making it hard for hitters to hit the ball over their head, and knowing they can come in and have the opportunity to catch the ball on the bounce, an extra edge in playing defense. So it's really hard to win by hitting home runs. You have to hit the ball into the gaps. Another major difference. If you go to a vintage baseball game, you will see a man standing to the left or the right of home plate. Sometimes he will be in a player's uniform holding a bat. Other times he may be wearing a top hat and carrying a walking stick. He is the umpire. The umpire has two primary roles, calling balls and strikes and calling fair or foul hits. Strikes and balls are very different at the time. Strikes, called strikes, swinging strikes are part of the original Knickerbocker Rules. Called strikes are introduced in the late 1850s in order to give the batter some incentive to swing at a pitch. Balls are introduced for the 1864 season for the same reason, to give the pitcher some incentive to throw the ball where the batter can hit it. But there are still some other major differences. Both the striker and the pitcher are entitled to a warning before a ball or a strike is called. For example, if the striker swings and misses at the first two pitches and then takes a pitch right down the center of the plate, he's entitled to a warning. So it's not a called third strike, it's a warning to the striker. And also, by the way, foul balls are not strikes. They will not become strikes until early in the 20th century. Called balls are also different. It takes only 3 balls for a walk, and on all walks, all runners on a walk move up, regardless of what base they're on. So for example, if a runner is on third and the striker walks, the runner on third scores. I can't prove it, but I believe that's the origin of the expression, a walk is as good as a hit. Final major difference between then and now is the schedule. In the 1860s, competitive match play didn't really get underway until June. May was devoted to practice. April was devoted to getting organized. But the season ran through November, ran literally through as long as it was warm enough to play. So the first national holiday associated with baseball is not the 4th of July, but rather Thanksgiving. In April of 1861, on a Saturday morning, our friends from the Hamilton Club get together at the United States Hotel in Jersey City to plan for the coming season. The Hamilton are a very contentious group of young men. They talk about how many match games they're going to play, where they're going to play, what days of the week they're going to hold practice, and they can't reach agreement on any of those things. But it really doesn't matter, because that meeting is literally the last entry in the Hamilton Club's minute book, because that meeting took place on April 11th, 1861. And the following day, the Confederates fire upon Fort Sumter, and the Civil War is underway. The Hamilton Club goes out of existence, never to be heard from again. It used to be thought that the Civil War helped spread baseball throughout the country, especially into the South. That theory is pretty much discounted today. It might even be better argued that the Civil War slowed down baseball's growth in its early years. Certainly, there's plenty of evidence that baseball was played in the South before the Civil War. What's really true is that after a year or so, baseball and the Civil War kind of have a separate parallel existence without much interaction. There are a couple examples, though, that I want to mention briefly. The first is that it's definitely true that Union troops played a lot of baseball during their spare time behind the Union lines, and that's certainly true of New Jersey troops. This is just one example. This is a rough box score from a game played in early May of 1863. from the officers and by the officers and senior enlisted men of the 11th New Jersey, one of New Jersey's most storied Civil War regiments. We have this box score courtesy of a man by the name of Thomas Marbreaker, who was a member of the regiment and who kept this scorecard for like 30 years and then included it without explanation in his history of the regiment. I have my own theory about why he included it. As I said, this game was played in early May of 1863. About 60 days later, in a small village in central Pennsylvania called Gettysburg, the 11th New Jersey was in the worst of the fighting along the Emmitsburg Road, to the point that within 15 minutes, the regiment went through three different commanding officers. And by the end of the day's fighting, every officer above the rank of lieutenant was either killed or wounded, including the two captains, Captain Martin and Captain Logan, the captains of these two teams. And others of these officers and senior NCOs were killed later in the war or even suffered the experience of being POWs. My guess is that when he tried to remember these young men in their prime, Marbreaker wanted to do that by remembering them playing what was already something that was considered part of the national pastime. One place where there was interaction between the war and baseball was in the spring of 1864, when a series of fundraising events, fundraising fairs, were held throughout the North for the benefit of the United States Sanitary Commission. Sanitary Commission was sort of a combination of the Red Cross and the USO, devoted to serving the needs of soldiers and their families. One of the most important of those fairs took place in Logan Square in Philadelphia in June of 1864. Somebody, possibly the famous sports writer Henry Chadwick, had the idea of, why don't we play a series of baseball games the week before the fair, charge admission, and use the proceeds for the Sanitary Commission. Unfortunately, all but one of the games was rained out. But one game was played, and they charged the unheard of admission fee of 50 cents to watch two teams play in what we would call an all-star game. At the time, it was called a game between select or picked nines, but it was in effect an all-star game between an all-star team from New Jersey and an all-star team from Pennsylvania. And I'm very pleased to tell you that the team from New Jersey won. The war, as we know, ends in April of 1865, just in time for the 1865 baseball season. Baseball is now going through a transition. The pioneer period is basically over. Baseball is becoming increasingly competitive, heading towards professionalism, headed towards the formation of major leagues. New Jersey's role as a cradle is no longer needed. The question is, does New Jersey still have a role in this new, more competitive era? Certainly the players and teams of the time think they did. The best baseball in the mid-1860s is played in Brooklyn, and the best team in Brooklyn is this group, the Atlantic Baseball Club of Brooklyn. To show you that history does repeat itself, of the Atlantic Baseball Club, which is one of the top vintage baseball teams in the country. In the 1860s, the Atlantics didn't always win the championship, but they were always right there in the competition. In 1864, they were undefeated, and so in 1865, they're defending their championship. The championship is very informal. It's not recognized by any national body. And the way it works is that any team can challenge the champions to a best-of-3 series. And if you beat the champions in the best-of-3 series, then you become the champions until you be dethroned by somebody else. Well, our friends, the Eureka Club, are determined to have a shot at that. And so they challenge the Atlantics to a best-of-3 series. In August of 1865, the Atlantic arrive in Newark for a game before a crowd estimated at about 5,000 people. The Atlantic take a 6-run lead into the bottom of the 9th inning. The Eureka stage a desperate 9th inning rally, but fall one heartbreaking run short. A few weeks later, the Eureka journey to Brooklyn for the return match. This time, they take a 3-run lead into the bottom of the 9th inning, but are unable to hold it and again come up one heartbreaking run short. Hard to have come any closer. Even with these two heart-rendering losses, the Eureka still have an excellent season in 1869. And I'm sure they thought that their best days were ahead of them. In fact, their best days were behind them. And by 1869, the Eureka are out of business. Their place is taken by an upstart team from a small farming community on the outskirts of Newark called Camptown, that we know today as Irvington. There had been an Irvington baseball club before the Civil War, but for 1866, the Irvington club decides that they're going to become a senior club and they're going to take on the best teams in the country. They do what a lot of new teams would do at that era. Early in the season, they take a trip over to Brooklyn to watch the Atlantic team practice. While they're there, they take advantage of the opportunity to introduce themselves to a man by the name of William Babcock, who is the non-playing president of the Atlantics. I think this is really the reason they made the trip. And they explain to him that they are a new team. They are, in their words, a mere country team, very inexperienced. They need help. What really would help them would be if he would bring the Atlantic to Irvington, play a game there that would teach them a few pointers. We, they said, don't have any expectation or hope of winning the game. But even if you defeat us by a score of 100-10, we won't complain about it. Please give us a chance. Mr. Babcock is a very nice man, but he has no idea what's going on here. So he says yes. The Atlantic Club, a little bit later in the season, make the trip to Irvington. They're playing this new team, so they obviously don't need to bring all their best players, so they leave 2 or 3 of them behind. And they take the arduous trip by stagecoach, railroad, ferry, and they finally arrive in Irvington. I think that they expected to see a bunch of country bumpkins playing, some of them probably not having uniforms, some of them probably playing in their bare feet, a bunch of players they had never seen before. To their surprise, they see a number of players they had seen before, because the Irvington Club is made up not just of some fine players from Irvington, but other players from Newark who have come together to form the Irvington Club. The Irvington Club wins the game. It is the greatest upset of the 1860s. The Irvington Club, over the next 2 years, 1866 and 1867, will wreak havoc with the established baseball world. They don't win the championship, but they will pull a number of upsets like this one over the Atlantics, including in 1867, they will twice defeat the Union Club of Morrisania, the ultimate national champion, but the games don't count in championship competition because the Union Club are not the champions at the time. After 1867, however, the Irvington Club also fades on a competitive basis. They don't go out of business, but they're no longer as competitive. Clearly, New Jersey cannot compete on a consistent basis at the highest levels. Is there any role left for New Jersey? Well, there is, and it's symbolized by this picture. This is a picture of the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings. And here again, we need to do a little bit of myth debunking. Some of you may have heard that the Red Stockings were the first professional team, the first openly acknowledged all-professional team, the direct ancestors of today's Cincinnati Reds. None of that is true. The best way to think of the Red Stockings is that they are the team that truly made baseball popular on a national basis. Because in 1869, the Red Stockings will literally travel from the East Coast to the West Coast so that fans in New Jersey and Brooklyn, as well as fans in San Francisco, California, can all say that they saw the best team in the country play in person. Think about how unique that was. It's going to be another 90 years before Major League Baseball reaches the West Coast. How do I know that the Red Stockings were the best team in the country? Well, in 1869, they played 57 match games and they won all 57 of them. A year later, they will win 18 consecutive match games before finally losing to the Atlantic Club of Brooklyn. in a game that many consider to be the greatest game of the 19th century, and some consider to be the greatest game in baseball history. This picture is basically a picture of the entire team. They may have had a substitute, but it was a much smaller roster. Look at the right-hand column. The second man from the top is a man by the name of Charles Sweezy. Below Sweezy is a man by the name of Andy Jackson Leonard. They both grew up in Newark. They learned how to play baseball in Newark. They were both members of the Irvington Club in 1866 and 1867 before heading west to join the Red Stockings. Here is a new role for New Jersey baseball, a cradle for baseball talent. And the best example of this in the 19th century is this man, Mike King Kelly from Paterson, New Jersey, considered by many to be the greatest player of the 19th century. Without question, he was the highest paid player of the 19th century, and not just because of his salary. Kelly was the first player to earn significant off-the-field money. A song was written about him called Slide Kelly Slide, which became America's first hit record. This lithograph of him sliding into second base sold many copies and was put up prominently in taverns and bar rooms throughout Boston and all of New England. And it's a direct link between this Mike of the 19th century and this Mike Trout of the 21st century, who, if money means anything, is arguably the best player in baseball today. Baseball in the 19th century and today continues to be a cradle for baseball talent. New Jersey was a very important part of early baseball, and baseball has been an important part of New Jersey ever since. Thank you.
John, thank you for that. It's very entertaining and educational. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat. I do see we have a couple that have come in, mainly about baseball in Middletown. And John, I know you're not a local to Middletown or even the county, but do you have any knowledge about baseball that happened maybe in our county?
Baseball, it seems like baseball down the shore got its start with the hotels along the shore that had visitors from New York City and otherwise who played baseball and then wanted to play it on vacation. There was a baseball game played in Long Branch before the Civil War, but it's hard to identify the players and tell whether they were local or not. But that seems how baseball got started down the shore.
Okay. A question from Mark. I am intrigued by how the explosion of adults playing baseball in 1857 to 1859 coincided with the financial panic that triggered so much unemployment and economic uncertainty. What do you think of the idea that young men in their 20s with time on their hands and no small amount of distress during a slow recovery turn to the game of their boyhood as a distraction or an escape?
Well, it wouldn't have been the game of their boyhood because they would have been pretty young at the time. I mean, in New Jersey anyway, I don't think it's unlikely we're talking about young men who played organized baseball at all before 1855, and most of them the years thereafter. One of the big issues, though, for players at the time is getting time to play. The only day of the week everybody's off is Sunday, and playing baseball is against the law on Sunday. So, you can't play it then. So really the only young men who can play baseball are those who have some control over their time. So you see that most of the early baseball players they're not working class, they're not laborers, they're artisans, white collar workers who have some control over their time. It's certainly possible that if players were off from work because of being laid off or their business is being closed, that they turn to that. I hadn't thought of that. It certainly could explain part of why the game spread so rapidly in the late 1850s. Certainly be a contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. John, do you happen to know when baseball fandom, as we know it today, began?
Oh, almost immediately. I'm not sure if the year is either 1857 or 1858. I'm not sure which. There were three, again, they wouldn't have been called all-star games, but three all-star games were played between teams from Brooklyn and New York. They were called the Fashion Course Games because they were played at the Fashion Course racetrack, which was located near Willets Point, which is near where Citi Field is today. And the reason they played the games at the racetrack was because they wanted to charge an admission fee, and that was an enclosed facility. So, baseball, there were fans almost right away. One of the reasons for that, perhaps unfortunate sides of it, is that baseball almost immediately gambling becomes part of baseball. And so people go to see the game and they go to bet on the game. But baseball fans, get started right away. Now, the first, paid admissions aren't the norm until the early 1860s, when the first enclosed ballparks are set up in Brooklyn.
A couple more questions we have, John. Do you know what their first professional team in the state was?
Well, the problem with the defining professional is it's not, for a long time, through 1869, openly paying players is against the rules. But we know that players were being paid under the table. We know, for example, that the Eureka Club had paid players in 1866, because that's one of the things that turned them off on the game, because it brought in some of the unsavory element that they didn't like mixing with. If we're talking about the first true professional team, it would really be the Elizabeth Resolutes. The first all-professional league is formed in 1871. It's called the National Association, and it existed from 1871 to 1875. Its records are not recognized by Major League Baseball. It goes out of existence in 1875. In 1876, the National League is formed, continues to this day, the oldest ongoing professional sports league in the world. One of the weaknesses of the National Association was that any club that came up with a $10 bill could join. That's all you needed, was to be able to pay the $10 entrance fee. In 1873, the Resolutes, who had had success on a semi-pro basis, decide that they're going to try their hand playing in the National Association. They're going up against teams with fully salaried teams, and all they have are the gate receipts to share. They end up, they went, I think, 2-21 and disbanded before the season was over. They did have a moment of glory, however. On July 4th, 1873, as part of the first all-professional doubleheader, they defeated the Boston Red Stockings, who are the heirs of the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And 4 of the players who took part in that game in 1866 also took part of the game in 1873.
Interesting. John, were there any established standards for these early baseball games, such as field dimension, baseball size, things like that?
Okay, the field dimensions, the oldest surviving written rules for baseball are the Knickerbocker Rules, which were written in 1845. The problem with the Knickerbocker Rules is they don't give you enough information on how to play a game. They clarify things that were previously apparently unclear. They give dimensions on the number of paces between home plate and second base. The question is, how many feet to a pace? If it's 3 feet, then the bases were always 90 feet. But probably in the 1840s, a pace was a little bit less than 3 feet. So it's very possible that the early bases were 70 to 80 feet apart. In the late 1850s, these kind of things don't matter until competitive baseball starts. Once competitive baseball gets started, then you care about these things. And so in the 1850s, late 1850s, the National Association of Baseball Players, which is really a group of clubs, come together and approve rules. And they formalize the 90 feet, they formalize the size of the baseball, and they adjust it. It's adjusted based upon experience from that point on.
John, we know that baseball evolved from other similar type games. Is there any record of those type of games being played prior to baseball coming onto the scene?
Okay. First of all, baseball did not evolve from cricket. Cricket and baseball are cousins. That is, they're descended from other bat and ball games. There's been talk that baseball was descended from a game in England that I'm blanking out on what the name of it is, but that's also been discounted. The current belief is that baseball is based upon an English game called, of all things, baseball. There are references even in Jane Austen's writing that go back into the late 18th century to games called baseball. You also hear about town ball. Town ball was a catch-all phrase used to describe different types of baseball. There was a town ball club formed in Philadelphia in the 1830s, but that played a very different kind of game. The way it evolved is that bat and ball games go back centuries, and they were popular in this country. It became increasingly popular in this country in the first half of the 19th century. The issue was that young men, that is men in their late teens and 20s, were not supposed to play games. That was frowned on. As the idea of physical fitness, muscular Christianity developed, it became acceptable and desirable for young men to play games. This child's game of baseball was there and easily adaptable. And so that's one of the reasons it caught on so quickly.
Yeah, I think this might be the last question of the night. Let's see if we can stump you with this one. There was a New Jersey player named Hatfield who could supposedly throw a ball almost 400 feet. Have you come across him while you have done your research?
I've never heard that story. I'm not sure. One of the questions would be what year we're talking about.
Yeah, he doesn't list that. Mark, if you want to let us know what year that is, we can maybe get that in. He says 1860s, 1870s.
I'm pretty sure I have read every surviving newspaper account for New Jersey baseball through 1870, and I've never seen that. If somebody's got documentation of it and send it to me, I'd take a look at it. We're writing about it in my blog, but I'm comfortable in saying there's no contemporary evidence of that through 1870 in a New Jersey publication anyway.
Okay. So John, if anybody wants to learn more about early baseball history or New Jersey baseball, do you have any recommendations where they can find some good info?
Well, you can always start with my blog, A Manly Pastime, which is, I try to write about that. I also, I want to take this opportunity, this was not pre-rehearsed. I want to take this opportunity to mention this book, which the lecture is based on, the same title, A Cradle of the National Pastime, New Jersey Baseball. I mentioned that not for self-promotion. The book was published by the Morven Museum as a companion book to the exhibit that they did on early New Jersey baseball. All of the proceeds for the book go for the benefit of the Morven Museum. They don't come to me. It's available on Amazon, also available from Morven. It would be a good way in these difficult times to support New Jersey history. So I'd urge you to do that. There's also, I should also mention, because I see that my friend Larry McCrae is on this call, eavesdropping from Massachusetts. Larry is the founder and creator of a website called Protoball, which tries to document all baseball games played, I think, through 1870 and goes back into the early days of baseball. You take a look at that, you'll find a lot of evidence of early baseball, documented baseball. There's my friend Eric Miklich, M-I-K-L-I-C-H, has a 19th century baseball website that also has a lot of good information. And there are books by John Thorne, Peter Morris, and Tom Gilbert. Tom Gilbert's book is very new. If you Google them or go to them on Amazon, you can't go wrong with any of their books.
Yeah, I think I've read most of those, and those have been quite good. Looks like that's all the questions we have tonight, John. Once again, want to thank you for joining us. And is there anything else you'd like to say?
Just to thank everybody for being part of this. Thank for the Historical Society for sponsoring me, and everybody please stay safe.
Thanks for attending, everybody. Just another note, if you want any more info on us, visit us at middletownnjhistory.org. And if we don't talk to you, we'll see you next February. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good night. Thanks, John.
Thank you.